some more things this evening. Okay, so tonight we're going to talk about Blue Water Baltimore, a little bit about the stormwater issue, how you can make an impact at your home or place of worship or neighborhood, resources for more information, and we'll have time for a bit of a Q&A at the end, should everyone have questions. If you want to type questions in the chat as we're going, you're welcome to do so. I won't address them till the end, but that will be totally fine. So at Blue Water Baltimore, we're made up of 5 legacy organizations that all came together just over 10 years ago. We have 5 key programs: the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper. Many of you may have seen our boat out patrolling the waters. We also have an advocacy team, an eco-literacy team, a restoration team, and the nursery. And all of these programs work on upstream solutions to pollution, meaning that we're trying to prevent the pollution from happening rather than focusing on cleaning up the pollution that's there. We do often partner with organizations to do stream cleanups, which would be a downstream solution, but we mostly focus on ways to prevent that pollution from happening in the first place. So our waterkeeper team is made up of the Baltimore Harbor Waterkeeper. Her name is Alice Volpita, and 2 water quality scientists. They monitor by boat and by stream. All of this data is super important because it helps us see what the problems are to begin with and target areas for projects in the future, and to be able to track over time whether or not things that are being implemented by nonprofits or by the city are actually working. And all of our data can be accessed for free on this website, which is baltimorewaterwatch.org. You can scroll down and see a map of all 49 sites that we monitor. And if you click on each site, you'll get the information for the last reading, and you'll also be able to see a table of trends. And if you continue to scroll down, you'll see everything that we monitor for. So it's just a really fun website to see how the water quality is. And there is a lot of stuff going on in the water. The waterkeeper team also monitors the pollution reporting hotline. So if you see pollution in your streams or in the harbor when you're walking around anywhere, you can report it online, or you can save this phone number to your contacts like I have done and give it a call and just explain what you're seeing, and we'll follow up with the necessary authorities and try to figure out what's going on. When a lot of people report pollution, we will also post to social media or send an email alert out just to let folks know that we know it's happening, and if we figured it out, then we'll post that information too. Our advocacy team works on legislation, supporting legislation at all levels that promotes clean water and strong communities. So this was for the sewage backup hearing. So one main issue with stormwater is when we get a lot of it, it overwhelms our underground pipe system. And sewage will not only overflow into waterways, but it will also back up into people's homes. And for a long time, people were responsible for this cleanup, but now there's a program through the city where you can be reimbursed for that cleanup because it should be their responsibility. If you're familiar with the latest lawsuit, this is the Back River Waste Treatment Facility that was not doing things too great, but more information on this. It is an active lawsuit, so I'm not going to say too much, but more information can definitely be found on our website, and the link is on the screen. This is being recorded, so I put the links on the screen, so if you see it later, you can grab those if you want to. We also worked on the bag ban and the foam ban. So just trying to, when we notice a lot of one type of pollution, we're going to try to see how we can prevent that pollution from ending up in the streams in the first place. And our website, which is bluewaterbaltimore.org, has a page on advocacy, and currently session is happening. So you can go to our website and see all of the bills that we're supporting and what's going on to fight climate change, and also other green initiatives in Baltimore City and Maryland. Again, you can go to our website, it's bluewaterbaltimore.org, if you want to learn more about those efforts. Our eco-literacy team works with community organizations and schools, with children and with teachers to try to get the next generation excited about water, protecting our waterways. We have done in the past this workshop called the Fog Monster Workshop, which FOG stands for fats, oils, and greases. We're teaching kids and teachers what should and shouldn't go down the drain. Obviously, fats, oils, and greases should not go down the drain. They should go into your fog monster. And we talk about why that's important, and fatbergs and all that fun stuff. And it's really exciting. This was a Teach the Teachers workshop through the National Aquarium. And this is a great way to reach even more students. So we can't be in every classroom all the time, but the more teachers that we can engage in our programs, the more people we can reach. And this is a picture of Michel, who's no longer at Blue Water Baltimore, but he would do a mystery lab workshop with water, just focusing on all of the really cool properties of water. We also have a restoration team. You may have seen us in your neighborhood. I know we've worked in the area of Presbyterian Church doing tree plantings, but we do tree plantings and pavement removals to install green stormwater infrastructure. This is Jono and Zoe doing a tree planting in the Idlewild neighborhood, which isn't too far from you all. We have tree pruning events. So these are really important because the trees that we plant do need to be maintained for a few years to keep them healthy. If you've never pruned a tree before and you want to learn how, definitely attend one of our workshops. They're really fun, and it's a really way to get out. Really good way to get out there in the community and meet other tree people. We have tree giveaways. They're typically for Baltimore City and Baltimore County residents, and they take place at various locations where you can get usually up to 5 trees, but it does depend on the giveaway, anywhere from 1 to 5 trees, and most of the selections are native. We have experts, volunteers, and staff there to help you pick the right tree for your spot. And who doesn't love a free tree? We have organized stream cleanups with organizations before. If this is something you're interested in doing, you can send us an email. It's, again, not something that we spend a ton of effort on, but it is something that we're aware of and that we do try to support whenever we can. And then, of course, we have Herring Run Nursery. Herring Run Nursery has that name because the Herring Run Watershed Association is one of the groups that came together over 10 years ago to form Blue Water Baltimore, and it was part of that Watershed Association. We are a little tricky to find if you've never found us before. This is a picture of our entrance coming from Loch Raven Boulevard. We're on the back of the Mount Pleasant Golf Course. We will be opening for this season on St. Patrick's Day, which is March 17th. And in March, we'll be open Thursdays, Fridays, and Saturdays from 9 to 3. And then we'll extend our hours in April and May. Here is a picture of the nursery. So at Herring Run Nursery, we carry plants that are native to the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We try to carry as many straight species as possible, and I'll get into that, why that's important a little bit later on. But we do also carry cultivars. We haven't totally canceled those out of our inventory. We carry perennials, trees, vines, and shrubs. And when we're fully stocked, we have over 250 varieties of plants. At the nursery, we have 2 full-time employees and a seasonal staff person. And then we are very dependent on our amazing volunteer team. So if you are interested in volunteering at Herring Run Nursery, definitely send me an email. Our annual training is coming up and it's full. However, if we have enough additional interest, or if you really want to get involved several times, I'm more than happy to work with you on that. So just keep that in mind. And volunteers do receive a discount when they work, and you get first access to all the plants that come in the day that you work. So it's definitely a perk. All right, so back to stormwater and why it's an issue. This is an example of a sewage overflow. So there is raw sewage pouring out of this into the streams. And stormwater, if you think of it, right, like it's gonna take everything that's on the streets and push it into the streams. And that's something we want to avoid. Not only is it litter, but it's also smaller particulates, and it heats up when it crosses the pavement. So you're getting temperature, thermal pollution. And in urban areas, we have a lot of impervious pavement. And even lawns are sort of considered impervious because they're so compacted. So that just means that water doesn't go into the earth, it just goes across the earth. So you're getting erosion along with pollutants and high temperature water going into the streams and causing a lot of problems for the stream ecosystems. And if you look at a satellite image of really any urban area, but here we have Baltimore, it is a lot of gray, which again is going to be impervious pavement. And that's a problem for the environment, obviously. But there are definitely areas of potential to try to absorb as much stormwater as we can. Stormwater is going to continue to be an issue because development will continue to increase, and also rain will continue to increase. So this map shows the annual average change in precipitation in inches. As you can see, the dark green is 4 or more inches. And so we are in for more stormwater, and so we need more solutions. Green stormwater infrastructure is essentially using a combination of engineering and landscaping to address the stormwater issues. So the goal is to keep the stormwater from entering the pipe system in the first place. So rain gardens, typically you would imagine like a bowl in the earth designed to capture as much water as possible. It should be well draining, and it should also incorporate native plants that's going to help absorb some of the water and also infiltrate the water into the soil. Green stormwater infrastructure is just really a fancy way of dealing with the water and not having runoff. It can be done at all types of scales. This is at Medstar Harbor Hospital, and this is a really large scale project. Obviously, there's heavy machinery, lots of engineering involved, lots of landscape design involved. Here's another picture of part of the project at Harbor Hospital, just so you can get an idea of the scale. This was a really great site for this because they have a huge parking lot here, but they're also right on the water. So trying to capture this water, capture some of the pollutants, allow it to be absorbed by the plants and enter back into the earth before just washing everything off into the river. Here it is a little bit more established with the plant material. All of these plants are native plants. And then another type of green stormwater infrastructure would be rain barrels or cisterns. So this is at Stillmeadow Community Fellowship. And these are some giant cisterns that they've installed to water their new gardens. If you're familiar with that group, they're doing a lot with the environment in their Peace Park. And then there's also rain barrels for homeowners. So at Herring Run Nursery, prior to COVID, we had rain barrel workshops where you could come and learn how to build one on your own. Right now, we sell them as kits or as already assembled barrels. They're $100 assembled, and we'll let you know how to set it up when you get home. We hope to have more workshops in the future, but we're just going to wait and see what happens because this will be the first year back to normal operations. So we'll see what happens. And rain barrels come in all different shapes and sizes. This is the Earth-Minded Rain Station. A fancier version, we use the same setup. One great thing about this is if you think of a classic rain barrel where you would cut your downspout off and all the water would just run right into the barrel. We don't do that anymore because of the issue of overflow. So if it's overflowing right next to your foundation, that's going to cause problems for your foundation, and it's just not going to function as well as a closed system. It'll also have more mosquitoes. So this system, as you can see, this black tube goes right into the downspout, and this is the inflow and the overflow. So another great thing about this system is a lot of downspouts in the city will go under the sidewalks and out to the street. So if you cut that off, it doesn't have anywhere else to go besides by your foundation. So here it will, when it overflows, it'll continue to go out to wherever it went before you installed the rain barrel. And then another really popular thing to do is to plant a rain garden. There are several things you need to think about when planting a rain garden, and definitely a lot of resources that you should check out if this is something that interests you. The main thing that I tell people is it has to be at least 10 feet from your foundation. Again, we don't want water sitting against our foundation. That's not going to be good for anybody. So as long as you have that space where you can create it at least 10 feet from your foundation, then definitely continue to look at this option. Another thing you want to do before you start digging out your rain garden is to do a percolation test. So that's when you're going to dig a hole, pour water in it, and see how long it takes to soak into the earth. If it's still sitting there a day later, that's not a good place for a rain garden because it's not ever going to go in. It's just going to hold the water. It'll be turning into a pond, essentially. You want to make sure wherever you're going to put this garden, the water is going to sink into the earth. There's lots of different tools online to figure out what size your rain garden should be. So the main thing to take into consideration is the surface area of runoff, if you think about your roof. To help people with this, I often use Google Earth. If you're familiar with this free software that you can use, there's a measuring tool and you can measure the square footage approximately of your roof. And then this rain garden calculator, which is online, and I can put the link in the chat later. You put in your surface area, how many downspouts you have, what your soil is like, and it will tell you the square footage your garden should be and how deep it should be and how much rainfall it's going to capture. So it's really great resource, and you want to make sure it's big enough for the amount of water it's going to be taking in. If you're interested in rain gardens, definitely check out Montgomery County's website. They have a Rainscapes program. They have lots of really great information on here, plant lists, sample plans, all kinds of things to get you started with a rain garden. We'll talk about some specific plants in a little bit, but this is, of all of the online resources, this is one of my favorites. They do mention a rebate program that unfortunately is not in Baltimore City or Baltimore County. That's specifically for Montgomery County, but more and more counties in Maryland are adopting this type of credit. So hopefully in the next few years, we'll be seeing something similar in the Baltimore area. If you don't have the space for a rain garden, or it just seems a little overwhelming and you have grass around your downspout, or you're not able to grow grass around your downspout because it's so wet, I always recommend this downspout garden, which is essentially a mini rain garden, except for that it's not designed to hold the water. All of the plants on here are ones that can handle periods of wet and periods of dry. This resource we'll talk about more at the end as well, but here's some plants that are included in this sample plan. The resource is Native Plants for the Small Yard, and it's by Kate Brandes, and she does some really great sample plans for folks to get started with native plants. So here is the example, here's her illustration, and then she also provides the plan with quantities and the layout so that you can implement it yourself. And you can just take this sheet of paper to any nursery, but preferably Herringham Nursery, and we can set you up with these plants. And we're also knowledgeable enough that we can offer you substitutes. So if we don't have turtlehead in stock, for example, then we can offer you something else that would work for that space. In her resource, she also offers substitutes for different environments. So this sample plan is designed for full sun, but she also gives an example for if it's wetter and has more shade on the right-hand side under these pictures. Oops. There's other examples. And this is a free PDF that you can download online. So I'll make sure you get the link to that. Okay, so I'm going to pause for a moment and check the chat if anyone has any questions so far. I do not. Okay, so Susie asked if the water pollution hotline is bilingual, and I don't believe it is, but I can look into that for sure. What kind of trainings do we do at Herring Run Nursery? So the volunteer training really is just an overview of what we do at the nursery, the types of plants we carry, and it's really heavily focused on our point of sale system. So a lot of our volunteers bring customers out. So it's helpful to know about the plant material, but you don't have to. And that helps free up the staff to assist customers with plant selection. And the resources can be found on our website, but I'll make sure to put the links in the chat at the end of this presentation, and I'll also email them to Jessica to send out with the recording after the fact. And water retention areas can be a place for native plants, so we will talk about that momentarily. And in fact, best management. So when talking about stormwater, a lot of times people throw around the term BMPs, and it stands for best management practice. So if you hear somebody referring to a BMP, they're probably talking about some sort of catchment for stormwater. And they used to be just ponds, and now they're slowly transitioning to be more of a landscaped feature. There are some plants that certainly do better than others in those environments. So we're going to switch over and talk about conservation landscaping, because a lot of the plants that I'll talk about here can also be used in stormwater gardening. One plant that's super popular that I don't have a picture of is called Juncus effusus, which is soft rush, and that is super common to plant in lower parts of stormwater areas. They can handle a lot of pollution, and they can also be underwater for an extended period of time. So if you have an area that is just really difficult and wet all the time, I definitely suggest Juncus. Okay, so conservation landscaping is essentially intentionally gardening with native plants. And this can be with stormwater issues. A rain garden is a type of conservation landscaping. It can be pollinator gardening. It really is like an all-encompassing term. And it's what I started to do in my yard. So I'm going to use my yard as an example because I receive all of my neighboring properties stormwater. So I have a lot of wet areas and it's slightly sloped. So most of the plants that I use in my yard are also great for stormwater. I also have a lot of deer, so if that is an issue for you, a lot of these plants will be a good option. And it's partial sun, partial shade, so I've got sort of a mix going on. So this area where you see a lot of ferns used to be all Pachysandra, which I know a lot of yards were all mostly a lot of Pachysandra at one point or another. So I've slowly started to take that away. And the taller plant is ostrich fern, but we'll go into the plant selection in a little bit more. One thing that's super important to do if you're planning to plant an area, whether it be a rain garden or anything else, is to do a site assessment. So you need to know how much sun the space gets, how wet it stays, what your soil is like, and whether or not you have any pests before you start selecting any plants. And for pollinators as well as for people, it's important to have something blooming from spring through fall. So having a guide like this, and I'll have a guide at the end as well, that shows you the bloom time is super helpful. All right, so in my garden, there is a small tree, relatively small tree, which is the sweet bay magnolia. This is often used in stormwater areas. It tolerates some salt, but it's not super salt tolerant, which is one thing that you will find in common with a lot of stormwater plants because they're often at the edge of a parking lot, which is treated with salt in the wintertime. So you want to make sure if your garden is going to receive any salt that you stick to a salt tolerant list. Sweet bay magnolia gets about 20 to 30 feet tall. It's semi-evergreen. I live in Ellicott City and mine loses its leaves every year. There is one in the courtyard of Towson Presbyterian Church that was evergreen when I saw it in the wintertime. So it certainly depends on how protected it is, whether or not it keeps its leaves. The flowers are super fragrant. They smell like orangey, lemony. They're delicious. They're wonderful. It's a wonderful plant. It's a multi-stem tree typically. The one at Towson I don't think is. I think it's a single trunk, but usually when you find these, they're multi-stemmed. Another plant I like to include in wetter areas, rain gardens, and anywhere that stays a little wet is Itea virginica, which is Virginia sweetspire. The names to the plants, by the way, are on the slide. So if you view the recording later and you didn't catch a plant that you were interested in, you'll be able to get the name there. This is a wonderful shrub. It slightly suckers from the root zone, so it's not going to take over like an invasive bamboo will, but it will sort of fill in and create a nice hedge. There are some cultivars that'll stay smaller, which are nice for smaller gardens and smaller yards, and the straight species will get about 4 to 6 feet tall. It's deciduous, so it loses its leaves in the wintertime, but it leaves out pretty early and it blooms pretty early. This is also a really great plant for pollinators. It's usually covered with like little skipper butterflies and bees, and great fall color. And a butterfly, this is on Itea at the nursery, actually. This plant, Senecio aurea, it's also called Picara or Paccara, or golden ragwort, or golden groundsel. It has a lot of names, but it is a wonderful ground cover. If you have shade to part shade, a slightly wet area that things don't really grow well in, and you have a lot of deer, I highly suggest planting this plant. It blooms in the mid-spring. For last year, I think it was 4 weeks mine was blooming. Great for pollinators. It's semi-evergreen, so it's great for other critters that need to have some habitat in the wintertime. And it will spread pretty aggressively. So it's not the best choice for a smaller space. And I definitely would use it as a lower level ground cover that's going to fill a bigger space. It'll spread by rhizome and by seed, and transplant super easily. So if it does start to spread somewhere you don't want it, you can easily pull it. That's my daughter, but she's standing with the ostrich ferns to show how tall they can get. This is another plant that's really great for woodland areas that can take it pretty wet. It is colonizing. It takes a few years, but once it gets established, it will start to form a small colony in the area. One thing to know about this plant is it is definitely a spring and early summer plant. By the end of summer, it gets brown. You can leave that, and it's best to leave things for wildlife, but in the front of my garden, I typically cut that back, and I've underplanted it with sedges so that when I cut it back, there's still something there and it's not just bare dirt. But it's a really fun fern because it gets so big. These are foam flowers. They are often on deer resistant lists, but if you only have a few, the deer will likely nibble them. But these are another great ground cover. They come in many different cultivars. Some spread more than others. The straight species tends to clump a little more than it does spread, but wonderful for pollinators. And it gets a really pretty fall color as well. It's a great front edge plant for wetter areas in partial to full shade. This is a picture after the ferns have been cut back, as you can see. And I noticed that I needed something evergreen and something to fill this space. So this picture really is just to show that your garden can be somewhat of a finished product, but it also can continue to change and ebb and flow. And in my yard, I move stuff around all the time. But here I'm adding Christmas ferns where either I didn't like something or the deer liked it too much or something like that. But they can be constantly changing. You don't have to stick with something if you end up not liking it in a few years. This plant is wonderful for rain gardens. This is summer sweet or Clethra alnifolia. And there's a hummingbird moth or sphinx moth here on it. They're so cute. They look like flying lobsters. But this plant is often used in stormwater areas. There are several different varieties. The straight species gets tall and a bit unwieldy. So I would say if you have a big space where you can mass plant a bunch of them, that would be best for the straight species. If you're dealing with a smaller area, one of the cultivars will be better, just because they're a little more compact and neat looking. This is Hummingbird, which is the shortest variety we carry. It gets about 3 to 4 feet tall with white flowers. The deer sometimes will eat the flowers, but they tend to not eat the entire plant. And then there's a pink flowering variety called Ruby Spice, which gets 4 to 6 feet tall. Oh, it's a video. You watch this little guy fly. They're so fun. Okay. So a lot of those plants are rain garden plants for partial shade to shade. One other thing to touch on about rain gardens is it is best to put them in full sun, because if you're catching water in a bowl, you're going to want it to evaporate a little more quickly if it's not infiltrating into the ground. So if you have a spot where you could choose for your rain garden between sun and shade, I would always stick it in the sun. That's also the case for pollinator gardens. They tend to do better in the sun. At Herring Run Nursery, we have some educational way stations or display gardens for customers to get inspired by. This is our pollinator garden. We also have an edible and medicinal garden, and we are working on putting in a bioswale rain garden all the way at the bottom, and we have a meadow. So of these plants in the pollinator garden, the Coreopsis, which is this yellow flowering, is often used in rain gardens, but not in the lowest part. So it can take moist soil, but it doesn't like to sit in water. So it's better up on the berm or towards the mid-level of your rain garden. Cone flowers are often used. Bee balm is sometimes used. I would stick with some of the varieties that are more resistant to mildew. Bee balms in general tend to get a lot of powdery mildew, which is mostly a cosmetic issue, but there are some varieties that are more resistant. Then any plant that has swamp in the common name, so swamp mallow, swamp milkweed, swamp, there's so many different things that are swamp rose, that you can pretty much guarantee is a wonderful rain garden plant. Somebody gave it that common name for a reason. So swamp milkweed is one that came to mind because we have common milkweed here and we have butterfly weed over here. They're both types of Asclepias, but if you're going with the rain garden and you want to support the monarch butterfly, you can definitely put some swamp milkweed in there, which we will carry at the nursery. Another plant in the pollinator garden that's great for rain gardens is called buttonbush. And it's over here, you can't really see it too well. But it gets a really beautiful circular flower. It can get anywhere from 6 to 12 feet tall, sort of like it's a large shrub, small tree kind of look to it. And then also chokeberries are really popular in rain gardens. There are some types of mountain mints that will work in rain gardens as well. This is one of the most popular pollinator plants. It is in the mint family, so it will spread pretty happily. So give it space. But if you're interested in pollinator gardening, you're not seeing a lot of pollinators yet, plant this plant and they will come. The really cool thing about this plant is if you use a magnifying glass in your garden, like I do sometimes, and you look at these flowers, you can see they have these little purple dots. So each of these little white blobs is the actual flower. But when you look at it from afar, the leaves, they're called bracts, and they're silvery bracts that happen around the flowers to draw the pollinators in. And so it has this like silvery sheen to it when it's in full bloom. So it's a really, really cool plant. Swamp rose is one I mentioned. So not only is it great for stormwater, it's also great for pollinators and wildlife. And if you look at this pollinator, you can see his thigh right here. He's got a pretty full pollen basket on him. So he's been enjoying his time at the nursery, collecting that pollen. The swamp roses and any of the native roses are not what you would think of when you think of like a tea rose or a knockout rose. Those are not native. The native roses have a shorter bloom time. They are still fragrant, but not as fragrant. So just keep that in mind. They're wonderful plants, high wildlife value, but it's not going to be the same thing as like a hybrid tea rose or like a bouquet of roses you would find at the grocery store. Very different. Another one of my favorites is spotted bee balm or Monarda punctata. To me, this looks like something out of a Dr. Seuss book, but this is great for pollinators and hummingbirds as well. The bee balms are also in the mint family, so they will spread. Give it space. If you have space, definitely. It is one that tends to not get powdery mildew as much. It is fragrant. Mostly the foliage is what's fragrant, but it's also really great for pollinators. Monarda fish Gelosa is another type of bee balm, and this is a video, I think. This plant attracts so many different pollinators and butterflies and hummingbirds of all different kinds. So definitely really great for open spaces and super popular in meadow plantings. So if you have a drier space and you don't have a lot of stormwater coming onto your property, a meadow is another way that you can get native plants in a little mini ecosystem happening on your property. Butterfly weed is one of the poster children for native plants. Of course, Asclepias is going to support the monarch butterfly. They lay their eggs on this plant and it feeds the caterpillars. This is in the pollinator display garden, but these are chunky little monarch caterpillars having a good old time. And of course we have one that has fully transformed into a monarch butterfly. This is another great pollinator plant, but also it's just transitioning the conversation into host plants for butterflies. This is Ruelia, which is wild petunia, and it is a host plant for the buckeye butterfly. There is a difference between pollinator gardening and butterfly gardening. There's a whole nother talk on all that, but basically, when you're gardening with butterflies in mind, you want to make sure you include their host plants, but as well as plants that are going to have nectar when the butterflies are around, because you want to have food for them when they become butterflies. Any questions so far? Let me check on the chat. Oh, someone has a ruby spice plethora. Oh, Cynthia asked if the downspout rain garden does not absorb rainwater. So it is designed to absorb the rainwater, but the plants are supposed to be absorbing it. So you're not digging it out to create like a little pond there. You're actually keeping it pretty level. The stones are there in the middle of the downspout garden just to help prevent erosion. And then the plants should absorb the rest of the water. You can still have it continue through that, but it's designed to help absorb the water when it's coming out instead of collecting it just to sit on your foundation. So hopefully that answers your question. Okay. So if you're just getting started, or even if you're experienced with gardening with native plants or gardening of any kind, the internet can be a little bit overwhelming. There are so many resources out there and it can be hard to find where to start. My first suggestion, if you haven't already, is to check out a book by Doug Tallamy or YouTube Doug Tallamy and watch one of his talks. He is sort of the native plant guru. We live our life by the word of Doug Tallamy. And Bringing Nature Home was his first book that really brought awareness to homeowners of the impact that they can have on their property. Then Nature's Best Hope came out next, and The Nature of Oaks is his latest book. If you have space to plant a tree and you can go with a bigger tree, definitely go with an oak. And there are some oaks that can take wetter areas. The swamp white oak is one in particular. Pin oaks can also take a lot of water. And trees are going to absorb way more storm water than perennials in the long run. So it's definitely the bigger plants you can get in, the better absorbing stormwater you're going to be doing. And there he is, Doug Tallamy. At Herringbone Nursery, we also offer a consultation service. So if you're still overwhelmed or you just want us to come out and take a look at your property, let you know what the options are, or maybe you already have ideas, you just want support for those ideas, or maybe you're a new homeowner and you just want to know what plants you have on your property. Rob and I do site visits. They're $150 for 1 hour. We come to your property. You ask us whatever you want to know. This service is limited to Baltimore City and Baltimore County during our busiest times of the year. But in the wintertime, if you live further out, we will come further out. If you're interested in this service, just send us an email to nursery@bluewaterbaltimore.org. We typically, this time of year, I think we're scheduling about 2 weeks out or sooner. Once we get it into April and May, it's going to be a longer wait time. So if you're interested in getting started for the season, give us a call sooner than later or send us an email. This is the resource that I mentioned, the Downspout Garden, before. It's native plants for the small yard. The link is at the bottom, and I can put all these links in the chat, like I said, at the end. But there's the Downspout Garden again. And then this is another super popular plan if you live in the city, sidewalk strip gardening. Again, things you need to think about are sight lines, because cars. And also salt tolerance is something that's really important for sidewalks in the city. So this plan has Amsonia in the middle, which is Blue Star is one of the common names for it, but this has Amsonia, and it's surrounded by moss phlox, which is a really popular ground cover that blooms early in the spring. This picture is blurry, and I'll put the link to the chat, but this is the Xerces Society plant list. So if you're interested in pollinator gardening, this is also a great resource. I love it because it's organized by bloom time. So even as your garden is establishing, you might be walking around in August and realize you don't have a lot happening in your garden in August. Maybe you should add something that's going to be blooming that time of year. You can visit a list like this, or you can come to the nursery. One thing about shopping at the nursery when things are blooming is sometimes it's a little off from what it would be if it was growing in your yard. Just something to keep in mind when things are started in the greenhouse. Sometimes their timeline is a little off, so just keep that in mind. And we'll be able to tell you if it's tricking you. If you are already into native plants, I'm sure you have seen the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Native Plant Book. It is available as a free PDF online, but this is also a great place to get started. Audubon has a wonderful, amazing plant database online. You can search for native plants there if you're interested in gardening for wildlife, and in particular, the benefits to birds for each of these plants. That's a great place to go. And then wildflower.org is the Ladybird Johnson wildflower, which is out of Texas, Wildflower Center, which is out of Texas. But they have a great database that you can search by state, and then you can put in filters like a height, a bloom time, a flower color, and it'll spit out a list of all the native plants that'll work for that area. One thing to keep in mind is that it'll include a huge list of plants. So not all of those are going to be easy to find at a nursery. So when you come up with your plant lists, if you do that on your own, just make sure that you're open to alternatives, because if it's a rare or endangered plant on your list or one that's just super hard to find in the nursery industry, you might want to go with something a little different. And there's so many scholarly articles on the benefits of native plants in so many different ways, particularly stormwater gardening, but this is just to show that there is plenty of information out there. If you like your library, you can have a field day on their databases. And don't forget to hug a tree. It's getting to be that time. So that is all I have for this evening. Hopefully I answered some questions, and I'm going to check the chat. All right. Okay, someone has used the Army Corps of Engineers wetland rankings for choosing rain garden plants. So it's definitely a good place to start. But as far as plants for bioretention natives, you can definitely go off of a source like that and then just double check to see if they're salt tolerant. There is a worksheet that I have. I don't think it's available online, but I'll make a note to include that in the follow-up of plants that are good for bioretentions. It doesn't list it by level. I don't think it does, but most of them can be at most levels. One plant that's often on lists, which I have more trouble with than not, are Inkberry Hollies, which are a really wonderful evergreen plant. They're great for pollinators, great for birds. But in my experience in bioretentions, I don't know if it's the salt or the pollutants or what, but sometimes they struggle in that environment. They're great for foundation plantings and all kinds of other plantings, but I've had a hit or miss experience with that one. Let me write a note real quick. Okay, Susie asked about dog urine tolerant perennials. That is one that there's just not a whole lot out there. I appreciate the question, but you're going to want to keep the dogs off of it. So that can actually really be a problem for the sidewalk strip gardens. And I've seen people put little signs out, which the dogs probably aren't reading, but putting a little fence around it, or even some like stones, some kind of barrier to keep the pets out. And just another shout out for Patterson Park Audubon Center. Also great plant lists created by them. And we do have those available at the nursery. We laminate them. You can't take them with you because we cherish them, but you can walk around the nursery with them and select plants that way. There's also plants for container gardening. So if you're a renter or you just don't have a yard, you can still garden for wildlife. I wouldn't necessarily do a stormwater planter in a residential setting. You can do that in a larger setting. But that is something you can still do. You can still make an impact. Okay. Ron, I'm not sure what your question is. If you want to unmute or clarify. We've got acres of macadam.
Macadam.
Oh,
Okay.
asphalt.
Oh. You can plant plants around the edges. Trees definitely would be a good choice, especially if it's an area that's not getting a lot of easy access for maintenance and watering besides stormwater. And Fawn asked which zizia I prefer, and that it is a house plant for the black swallowtail butterflies. I don't know that there's one that I prefer, but I always prefer it in bigger areas. So Zizia aria, which is golden Alexander's, is one of my favorite plants. It's in the carrot family, but it spreads by seed when it's happy pretty aggressively. So if you've got, again, an open area, a woodland area, if it's open woods, it needs some sunlight. That would be a good place for it. But Zizia aria is the one I have the most experience with, but Zizia aptera is another variety that can also be used, and there's nothing wrong with it. Planting oaks seems to be tricky. It is very tricky, and the squirrels make it even trickier. So I don't have any real advice other than protecting them from the squirrels. I do have a friend that got really into trying to grow oaks, and so he created this contraption with chicken wire and trying to keep the squirrels out, and the squirrels kept outsmarting him. So I'm not sure whatever happened with that endeavor. And I'm sorry that I don't have any other advice besides protecting them that way. Transplanting oaks that squirrels planted for you is definitely something you can do. However, you want to make sure you dig a big enough hole that you're getting the roots. So a lot of the oaks will have tap roots or just sensitive root systems, and the same as with redbuds. So redbud is another tree that will often seed itself very happily. You can transplant them, but you need to make sure you're digging further down than you think you should and get as much of that root as possible. There is a Liatris that I prefer, Fawn asked. So the one that there was a picture of in the presentation is Liatra Spicata. But there is a dwarf variety. It's a straight species. It's called Liatris microcephala, and the common name is just dwarf blazing star. And I've started to use it in a replacement for Liriope, although it's not evergreen. But it has this swirly foliage, and it's much smaller and compact, and it gets lots of flowers all over it, and it blooms in September. So it's usually blooming on my birthday, which is another reason I love it. We carry it at the nursery, and so I believe it is a mid-Atlantic native. So we do define our native range at the nursery as the Chesapeake Bay watershed. So it could be a Northern Virginia plant. We'll still consider it native. And another thing that we are starting to really think about, and a lot of people in this industry are starting to think about, is climate change. the plants are going to have to adapt, and there's going to be things that have been native here for a very long time that just aren't going to be able to hack it. So there are a lot of factors that we need to keep in mind. But like Virginia plants, Southern New York plants even will carry. Some of those are starting to phase out because of the climate. And it's also taking place with trees. A lot of tree selections are for larger scale urban projects are being driven by what's going to do best in a changing climate. And that also has to do with increased stormwater. There is a native Pachysandra, and it doesn't seem to be as hardy as the Japanese Pachysandra. Is there any advice? Well, just that you are 100% correct. The native Pachysandra is very slow to get established. We do carry it at the nursery when we can get it. It's often very expensive when you can find it. And it's not evergreen like the non-native Pachysandra. So if you're looking for a native alternative to Pachysandra, I highly recommend the Senecio, the golden ragwort. It's evergreen. It has a nice dark leaf. The deer tend to stay away from it. It really, in my yard, has completely filled spaces where I've ripped up a bunch of Pachysandra. And I'm not familiar with any like super high wildlife value of the native Pachysandra. While it is a great plant, I'm not sure that, I know it supports something, but I think that the wildlife value for the Senecio is going to be a little bit higher as well. Fawn asked about southern natives moving north to naturalized. The red buckeye, for example. I haven't seen the red buckeye used in bioretention and rain garden projects per se, but they should do fine in a moderate area. So even just in the vicinity, I wouldn't put it in the bottom of a rain garden though. It's a great plant and it's great for hummingbirds as well. But just to point out that, touch on her idea of things naturalizing in new areas, it is something we, it's one of those like existential problems that I deal with every day, that these plants are shifting and we're so used to a certain range for these plants. So we have to be willing to accept these shifts to a degree. We don't want something to come in and take over the environment, but we also need to understand that it is a process, and that this process has been going on since way before we were around. So it's just something to keep in mind. But in all, we stick to plants that are within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. And we're also always learning. So there are times where we find plants that one resource might say that it's native to our watershed and another resource might say not. So we kind of, there are things that we have to discontinue over time, and we are always learning. It's always a learning experience. How much is the Lancaster area responsible for Chesapeake Bay pollution? I don't have the information to answer that question right now, but I do know that Lancaster is doing a lot of stormwater work. So if you're ever in that area and you're walking around their streets, take a look around, you'll see all kinds of bump outs, which are when the curbs bump out into a garden area. They're doing tons of that stuff. But as far as pollution goes, I can't answer that. I'm so sorry. Any other questions about plants for your space or gardening? I think we're getting close to time, but I can take a few more if there are any. One other thing I'll say just quickly about the nursery is when we open for the season on St. Patrick's Day, I'm not sure if I mentioned this already, but we're starting the year with mostly the plants that we ended last year with. So when you come into the nursery the first week or two, it's not going to be fully stocked like that picture I showed. It's going to be the end of March, beginning of April, when we start getting a lot of new material in. Our current inventory is posted on our website. So if you're curious just to see what we have right now, you can definitely do that. And you can always call us before you come if there's something you're looking for in particular. But if you're on Facebook, definitely follow us. I post there whenever we get big orders in. If there's plants that people have been asking about a lot, then I'll let the internet know that it's come in. So that's definitely a place to follow us. We also have an email newsletter that goes out for the whole Blue Water Baltimore organization. We have a couple more questions that I'll address, and then we'll call it a night. Our inventory, great question. So we receive all of our inventory from within the Chesapeake Bay watershed. We grow many plants ourselves, typically perennials. We'll get them as plugs. Some of them are grown from seed and some are not. That's another topic for another day, but we can get into it. But we receive perennials from 2 wholesale growers within the Baltimore area. And we only buy plants from people who have committed themselves to not using neonics, which are harmful chemicals to pollinators. So it's been shown that it's causing a lot of problems with bees in particular. So if a company uses neonics on any of their plant material, we won't buy plants from them. But we are trying to grow more and more every year, whenever we can. Any insight to the replacement of red twig dogwood and other natives on the medians? So I would go with chokeberry if height's not an issue. Red twig dogwoods are a wonderful plant, especially for winter interest, but they're super susceptible to fungal issues. So while they can be used in rain gardens, it needs to be an area with really good air circulation and full sun. If it's, well, unfortunately, it's in Maryland, so it's going to be really humid in the summertime, and that is really what gets these fungal issues on some of these plants, like the bee balm I mentioned, and red twig dogwoods. So I would look into the red chokeberry. There's also black chokeberry, but the red chokeberry would also have that winter interest and be good for the birds. Well, that is all I have for this evening. I am so grateful for you all staying and listening, and I will be at the nursery almost every day we're open. So if you want to come out and talk about plants, come on down.
Thanks, Mary. We will send the recording to everyone who registered in case you want to go back and check any of the websites or specific plant names or find any of the links. So thanks everyone for attending. I hope you guys all learned something new to implement in your gardens.